You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of The Big Album Show with me, Paul.
And me, Dan.
This is a very special show, something slightly different from myself and Dan today. We are talking about the score, about the soundtrack from the incredible horror film, The Exorcist. This show is a little bit different, as I said, in that The Exorcist soundtrack is not quite the normal soundtrack, and we will discuss how and why as we go through the show. But it is a Halloween themed show. It is a little spooky. And just to say that if you are feeling in any way, if you find maybe some of the talk of horror and so on, if it triggers you in any way, please just plug out, Dan, I think, because we don't want to scare anybody, do we?
Oh, I think people will be very, very scared when they hear this podcast, because I'm like, the movie we're talking about is The Exorcist, and I know you're gonna do an introduction to the film now, but like, genuinely, there's something so scary about the film that when me and you discussed talking about The Exorcist on this show, I almost had second thoughts, because like any superstitious bone I have in my body was triggered by even the thought of covering this movie.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things about the movie, Dan, is what I find fascinating is, so obviously, let's trace the history for a second for people who don't know. So William Peter Blatty writes the book. It's released 1971. It's a kind of a Catholic novel, essentially. He credits, for example, in the book, in the novel, a number of Jesuit priests. It's a very Catholic novel, and what it does really is it discusses a kind of it deals with religious and scientific subjects, and it really discusses, is this demonic possession possible, and what is it? And there's this great debate going on in the novel. Now, that's kind of lost in the film, because the film comes out in 1973, re-released in 1998 in Ireland, when I saw it, and it hadn't been seen for some years, and it blew me away when I saw it. And I remember when I saw it in 1998, and people literally hid behind their seats. Now, that now, more than 20 years on, looks a little bit trite, because we have been desensitized, we've been de-shocked, if that's a word. Originally, when it came out in 1973, people, the first showings of it, you hear about people vomiting, people fainting, and people having all sorts of reactions to it. But one of the interesting things about The Exorcist, two interesting things about The Exorcist, as a horror film, the most successful horror film of all time. But what's remarkable about it is the influence that it had on popular culture, because it has given birth to dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of copycat films. You turn on any streaming service and you just check it out, you're going to see the exorcism, the possession, all of these different things that were heavily influenced by The Exorcist. That's number one. Number two is that it completely it launched again, and it was part of a wave. It wasn't solely responsible, but the horror genre had been dying out. It had this big boom in the 30s, but again, it reemerged then, and The Exorcist was very, very, very much part of that as the most successful film of all time, horror film of all time. Now, another interesting thing about it, of course, Dan, is there is some amount of documentaries available and podcasts available. I mean, there are stories and stories and stories about stories when it comes to The Exorcist.
Yeah, it's like, there's a great one I watched that was on the release when it came out in video in around 1998, just after it had been in the cinemas for a short period. That was on that, and it has interviews with the cast and the writer and the director, and that's one of the best ones. It's on YouTube, it's like the first one that pops up. But you're right, when you think about this film, and you think about doing a podcast on the film, it's almost hard to know what to talk about, because everything's been talked about before. But like, as you say, it was effectively banned in Ireland until 1998, because it was actually the British Board of Film Classification who banned the video release of it of it in 1980, which effectively meant it wasn't freely available in the Republic of Ireland either. And when it came out in 1998, I would have been in school, and I remember it very well. And I remember watching it as a kind of a teenager, I suppose. And although Ireland was a much more modern country in 1998 than it would have been when the film was initially released in the 1970s, it still was it still was quite a Catholic country. And
Sure.
you know, I went to a Catholic school, and all that entails. And I remember when everyone in the schoolyard was talking about this film, it was seen differently from other horror movies like, you know, Scream or those various films, because people genuinely really felt, and many people still do, by the way, but felt that the evil within this film, depicted in this film, was something very, very real, something that had the potential to actually impact other people's lives. And there was all these stories and urban legends, which I'm sure we'll get into, around the film in terms of things that happened on the set. And you know, there's actually still priests in Ireland at the moment who carry out exorcisms, right? One of them, a fella called Father Pat Collins, you might have seen him on the Late Late Show. Like, he spoke in detail about carrying out real exorcisms. And he said, like, Ryan Tuberty, the presenter of this talk show in Ireland, asked him, you know, what do you see when you go into a room and you're about to carry out an exorcism? And he said, you know, you might meet someone who knows everything about your past, that understands languages they never learned, that have superhuman strength. And he even said, you'll hear they have a really strong, deep, raspy voice, which is everything that's depicted in this film. So some people, you know, some people really genuinely believe that the evil depicted in this film is a real presence in the world, which I think makes it all the more scary for people, you know?
Yeah, no doubt about it, Dan. And I mean, I suppose where I'm coming from in relation to why that is or how that is I think it's a lot to do with the success of the director and the cast. I mean, William Friedkin, very successful director by the time he agreed to take on The Exorcist. He takes the book, Blatty does the screenplay. But I mean, I think Friedkin was very much the person in control. And one of the things he did lots of crazy stuff. A lot of this is out there, it's well publicized. It's all been said many times over. But one of the things I find remarkable about how he directed this, he slapped people in order to get a reaction out of them. But he also he refrigerated a lot of the scenes in the house. So when they look freezing, well, they are freezing because it's literally in a refrigerator. So Friedkin was willing to go to extremes to get this movie down and to get it right. And what an achievement it was. Now, he's an interesting character in his own right. He very much sounds like Trump. Is how he sounds like. He's this very, very brash, very direct, kind of off-putting way of talking, but equally, there's no taking away from his many achievements, but his singular achievement in The Exorcist is to make this thing believable, that you are automatically taken into this world. And one of the things I love the way, I mean, the sound, the score, the soundtrack, it was all him. He's the person responsible for the music in this film. And what he wanted to achieve was, he said, like a cold hand at the back of the neck. That's the effect that he wanted from the music. So it's only in a handful of scenes do things go up tempo and the music gets really, extreme and really loud. For the most part, the music is in the background and allows the sound to really, really come true. But one of the things I love, and look, Tubular Bells is the song that everybody knows from The Exorcist. That's the famous tune. That's the signature tune. But what he was looking for was like Brahms' Lullaby, which everybody in the world knows is how you would sing, a lot of people would know, is how you would sing a baby or a small child to sleep. It's that lullaby song. Go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep, little baby. That's Brahms' Lullaby. He wanted that. By chance, he was listening to loads of tracks and he comes up with Tubular Bells. That's the Mike Oldfield tune. And that's the tune from the soundtrack that everybody knows. Am I right, Dan?
Yeah, you are. Like, Before I talk about Mike Oldfield, because I've a bit to say on him, like your point about William Friedkin, and his approach to the music. I think it's fascinating. You're right, like completely right when you said he's kind of Trump-esque. I kind of laughed because I definitely agree with that. Like the way he approached people about the music for this film was quite funny. Like, so he first of all he approached a guy called Bernard Herrmann, who had written music for the likes of the Psycho movie. And when he first met Herrmann about The Exorcist, he played Herrmann the movie, and apparently Herrmann turned around to him and said, "Yeah, I think I can save this piece of shit." And Friedkin turned around and he said, "What do you have in mind?" And Herrmann said, "Well, look, there's this great church organ we should use." And apparently Friedkin turned around and said, "You want to use a church organ? Okay, nice meeting you. It was great to meet an interesting person." And then he got a guy called, I think he pronounced his name, Lalo Schifrin, to write a score for the movie. And he wrote the whole score. And like you said, he didn't want the soundtrack to kind of overwhelm the viewer. And he basically asked Schifrin to kind of tone down the soundtrack. Schifrin said no, and again, your man just said, "Okay, see you later." So when people are recording movies, they generally, directors generally pick what they call a temp track to go over the movie, which is kind of random music that they've picked for the particular scenes, but that they're going to replace later with something more specific. What ended up happening with The Exorcist is that the temp track that the director chose for the film ended up being the music that they kept. Now, they re-recorded it specifically for the film, I suppose, so it all kind of flowed in together, sounded similar in that. But that just kind of gives you an insight into how single-minded he was in terms of how he approached the movie. And when he found Tubular Bells, he actually found it by mistake. He was going through various records and he had a copy of this record, and it didn't even have the proper label on it. It was a white label disc, handwritten Tubular Bells on it. He put it on and he heard Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. And Tubular Bells in itself, of course, is an album by Mike Oldfield released in 1973. And like when you listen to that music, it's incredible to think that Oldfield was only 17 when he wrote that music. He recorded the initial demos for the music on a 2-track recorder. So nowadays, the likes of Jacob Collier and great musicians like that have, technology at hand, and they can basically record as many tracks as they want and edit and so on. He was recording a demo for Tubular Bells on like 2 tracks and managed to do that. And like, of course, then there's interesting connections there with Richard Branson. You know a bit about that, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Branson had been the person to quote unquote discover Oldfield, and Oldfield was an integral part of the success of Virgin, and the early success of Virgin. It was a very successful record in its own right. And you see, this is a fascinating thing about The Exorcist. I mean, it's the characters that got involved in this and are somehow related to this story. I mean, you mentioned, Dan, and I think it's one of the interesting things, Bernard Herrmann, who's a huge 20th century American composer, and had done the score for, he recorded responsible for the scores for Citizen Kane, Taxi Driver, Psycho, as you mentioned, and many, many others. He, to reject him out of hand must have been, it's a reflection of the confidence that Friedkin had in this film, but also, I mean, also just how sure-footed this director was in what he was doing. And I think one of the things that he didn't like about what Herman was saying. Was Herman wanted him to cut the Iraqi scene. So the Iraqi scene is the first scene. It's very, very famous. Anyone who knows the film, these are million spoilers on there. Go and watch the film if you haven't seen it. But there's a great scene in the beginning where the young Father Merlin, we'll give them their film names. Father Merlin, the younger version of that, he is in Iraq, and there's this long encounter, and there's terrific sounds of people on an archaeological dig, and he comes face to face with a little emblem, and it's a fantastic introduction and brings you right in. It's you go into a strange world into Iraq. Interesting thing about that is, not to go off on a tangent, but that is the modern day Iraq. It's a place called Mosul, which is controlled by ISIL, the Iraqi version of ISIS. And again, it's just what you see in this film is, I think, the mastery of a brilliant director. He brings it to Iraq. That brilliant tune. It's done by the National Philharmonic Orchestra in London. It's a very, very subtle little piece of music. It's the first track on the soundtrack when it was released, and I think in 2016 or 2017 they put it right up there in the beginning, as you would. It's the opening scene. It's a beautiful piece of music. It's quite subtle. It lets the sound of all these shovels and then there's dogs barking. It lets all of that come to the fore, and that's what is the first track on the soundtrack version that is available, and it's terrific piece of music. I mean, Tubular Bells. I mean, you could easily record a podcast on Tubular Bells right now, and it would be interesting, and people would find something in it. I mean, it's recorded by Oldfield, and it is a terrific tune. I mean, there's loads of different trailers for The Exorcist, but you will find it wasn't in the original trailer. The original trailer is by far the most terrifying trailer. It's available on YouTube. It's the scariest. But in later trailers, they did use Tubular Bells. It's also it's the track that brings when we first encounter the home and the house in Washington DC, and it brings you right into that home and the familiarity of it and that kind of lullaby effect that Friedkin was going for. So it's just a terrific piece of music, Dan, isn't it? And I mean, again, it's something that almost the whole world knows, and it is a famous part of this movie, isn't it? Really, Tubular Bells.
Yeah, it certainly is. Like Oldfield was in a very vulnerable state of mind when he wrote and recorded Tubular Bells. So, we are talking the early 70s here, and there was a lot of kind of drug use and things like LSD. And apparently Oldfield had a particularly bad trip on LSD, where he kind of saw other humans as machines, meaty machines, effectively. But it really got into his psyche, and for a long time afterwards, he was very, very down, and music was his escape. So he spent a great deal of time escaping off into the musical world. And what a masterpiece he came up with. Like, he plays a lot of the instruments on the track. Like the whole track actually is like one track that extends over the whole two sides of the Tubular Bells album in its unedited form. And some of the instrumentation on it is amazing. Like, there's a live version of it you can watch on YouTube, which was on the BBC. And towards the end of side one of the Tubular Bells album, there's this bass line that Oldfield plays. It kind of comes in around 18 minutes. And he plays this bass line, a really complex bass line, for about 7 minutes. And if you watch the video of him playing this bass line, he plays it note for note perfectly, but it's so kind of difficult on the fingers. About halfway through, you can actually see him begin to wince, because he's like, his hands are actually getting sore from playing the bass line. So like he's a really unreal musician. And that opening scene then you mentioned with the music on the Iraq scene, as it's called, like it's just another example of the detail Friedkin had in mind. Like, when you look at it, when you're next time you're watching the film, right, even just look at how he did the opening credits, and he matched that up with the music. So the credits come up on the screen, and all of the credits kind of they kind of slowly appear on the screen, bar the title of the movie, The Exorcist, which just appears on the screen almost as a kind of a surprise. And just as The Exorcist title appears on the screen, that's when you get the chanting that's part of the first track on the soundtrack. So you have this kind of, like, he matched the music up absolutely perfectly with the film. But as you say, Paul, it's never overbearing. It never takes away from the sound effects. And the sound effects themselves are really interesting. They got nominated for an Academy Award, specifically for the sound effects. There was a guy working on the film called Gonzalo Guerrera, I think his name was. I probably pronounced the name wrong, but he was a Mexican sound engineer. And apparently, like, he almost literally at some stages went in and began watching the film on a screen and almost performed the sound effects for the film live. So, like, the famous scene in the film where her head is turning around, that's actually a wallet that he got off one of the crew with credit cards in it, and he's twisting the leather wallet. And that's the sound you hear for the neck going around. And it's really, really effective. So, like, the artistry of the whole crew on this film to make the sounds just, like, incredible. It's why it stands out all these years later as an incredible film. Because let's face it, some of the films in the horror genre have kind of aged badly. They're a bit passé.
I think there's no doubt about that, Dan. And I think many of the movies that the spin-offs, you'd almost call them, from The Exorcist, completely flopped. And if you look at something like Exorcist, the beginning, the prequel, a number of years ago, a poor show, and there's The Exorcist 2 and 3, which never really reached the heights of the film The Exorcist, the first one. Let's be honest, and that's to be kind about them. Then there was a TV show a number of years ago in 2016, I think, in The Exorcist, a two-series TV show, which was hard going to sit through, to be honest with you. I did sit through it, and so you don't have to, but it wasn't something that you would recommend. And then, of course, there's this litany of other ones. I mean, the best of them for me is The Exorcism of Emily Rose, but I don't want to go too far down that road, because we are on the music and on the soundtrack. It is all about the music. And I mean, I think I agree, Dan, everything that you had to say. The level of detail that goes into the tracks, the level of detail that's in the sound, it's replicated in every other part of this incredible movie. And you mentioned the wallet thing that make the sound. Of course, one of the things that comes to mind is that incredible dummy that they used with the swiveling neck, which is a scary looking thing right up until this very day. There's a couple of other things that I want to say. I mean, I do think it's important that we do our top 3 tracks, and we've always done it and everything else, so we'll do it on this. I mean, for me, Tubular Bells is number 1. Absolutely no doubt about that. I like the Iraq piece. I probably put that number 2. Just want to mention 5 Pieces for Orchestra, okay? Because that accompanies the hypnosis scene. And that is a terrific scene. And actually, I often, if given half the opportunity, I start to act that scene out myself. I have been known to try and do that, where it's the hypnosis scene where the psychiatrist comes around and he says, "I'm talking to the person inside of Regan now. If you were there, you two are hypnotized and must answer all my questions." I hope I haven't freaked anybody out now, but there's a terrific little piece of music in the background that's really soft, it's really subtle, and it's called 5 Pieces for Orchestra, and it's just brilliant. And you almost wouldn't notice it. But you take it out and when you take it out and listen to it as a piece of music in itself, it's a beautiful piece of music. Only once or twice does the soundtrack really kind of come to the fore and get really, really loud and really noticeable. The Night of the Electric Insects, Dan, is the standout scary track on this soundtrack. It is absolutely terrifying. Don't listen to it alone at night. It is in the movie. It is the part. It's in one of the most terrifying parts of the movie, and even describing it, actually, you kind of wonder, should you? Because you wonder you're going to freak listeners out. But it isn't. It's in a really scary part of the film, and it's a terrifying little piece of music in its own right. But that's one of the few loud pieces, if you will. And he obviously wanted Friedkin obviously wanted a particularly high dramatic effect on that. So most things are quiet, subtle in the background. And then once or twice, he brings it right up, and he does it there with the Electric Insects track. And, you know, that's my top four, actually. I don't know, Dan, do you have a top three or even four? Because I've done four.
What part of the film, what is the scene that you're referencing?
Sorry, the Night of the Electric Insect scene is where Regan is asleep, and she's breathing, and you can see the breath in the air, and apparently that is real breath in the air, because the whole place is refrigerated. So Regan is unconscious or asleep, and she's on the bed, she's breathing up into the air like that. And the housekeeper calls in for the Caris to see this, and it just comes up on her belly, "Help me," okay? And he brings it right up when you can see the writing coming out. It's just highly dramatic, highly effective, and again, it's that level of detail. And he says, doesn't he, Dan? I think you referenced it yourself earlier. He didn't want to tell people how to feel or how to fear, almost, but once or twice he allows the music to do that.
Yeah, that is one of the standout moments, both musically and visually, of the film for me. That'd be definitely up there as one of my number one musical moments. And I think that the scene itself is particularly shocking, because what you know, with these horror movies, I think, with like The Exorcist, what happens on the screen is actually only part of the horror. I think that helped me on Reagan's stomach suggests the turmoil that Reagan is going through, captured inside of her own body by the demon, you know. And that's why it's so psychologically scary. And then the music, as you say, really drives that point home. I do agree with you that Iraq is very strong. It starts the movie particularly well, and like, some people don't like the Iraq scene. I think it's really good. I definitely like it. Does kind of seem a little bit separate from the rest of the movie, but there's subtle reminders throughout the movie to it. And one of the interesting points, just random points about the priest, what's his name again? Father Lancaster Merrin, the older priest, who appears in the Iraq scene as a younger man. He although he's playing an older priest in later on in the movie, he was actually only 42 when he recorded the movie, and the effects on his face are incredible as well. And then, of course, my third my third track would be Tubular Bells, because Tubular Bells is actually an album. I know it's a separate album as well. But as an album, it's an album I kind of hold dear, because I remember when I was young, I must have looked like a little freaky 4-year-old, but my ma had it on a cassette, right? And on one side she had, because back then people used to record their vinyl onto cassettes, right? So on one side she had Tubular Bells, and the other side she had Tina Turner. And don't judge. And I used to listen to this cassette going around the house in a Walkman. And I remember one time we had a carpenter in the house, and he goes, "What are you listening to?" And I said, "Oh, Tubular Bells." And he kind of raised an eyebrow, thinking, "My God, is this Damien out of The Omen or something I'm talking to here?" But yeah, I think it's a fantastic, an absolutely fantastic piece of music. So yeah, but I suppose because it's a Halloween scary show, I think we have to indulge ourselves and talk a little bit briefly about the spooky occurrences that actually happened on the set. So many spooky occurrences happened on the set that they actually got a real priest to exorcise the set. Funny enough, Father Dyer, who appears in the film, he's the guy who gives Father Karras his last rites at the end of the film. He is actually a real priest. His real name is Father William O'Malley, and he performed an exorcism on the set because the set burnt down at one stage, and they couldn't account for why it burned down. And at another point, a Jesuit priest passed a miraculous medal to the man who plays Father Karras and told him to look after himself, because he was playing with some, dodgy spirits. And apparently, according to the actor who played Father Karras, the priest died within 2 days of giving him the miraculous medal. There was 9 deaths in total, sadly, connected with the film, and that's according to the actress who played Chris MacNeil, Ellen Burstyn, and there was various other occurrences, So some of these things are kind of urban legends, I think, but I think there is a grain of truth behind other things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's either it's in one sense incredibly unfortunate series of events. Now, with that said, I mean, film sets, and as we've seen, so tragically recently with Rust, and there, I mean, I've no experience. I've no experience talking about them, but I've no experience of what it's like to be on one, and slightly different era safety wise. I mean, the health and safety wasn't as it might be many decades later. I mean, for example, Linda Blair Regan famously suffered a very serious back injury, which she never quite recovered from. There was a whole heap of other, and I mean, one of the things about it is, it's almost as if there's tragedy and fear and horror right throughout everything to do with this movie. So, for example, and again, not to digress, but one of the things about this movie that I like most is the whole thing around Father Karras. He is an extraordinary, played by a playwright, of course, not a professional actor. That was Jason Miller, the very successful US playwright. He's a very haunted figure. And he plays this. There's this brilliant subplot, almost you might call it, in relation to his mother, and there's a huge amount of guilt involved. And then there's the scene in the psychiatric hospital, and you referenced, Dan, the real priest, and one of the terrifying thing. I mean, this is actually terrifying for me anyway. Well, not terrifying. Sorry, I scratched that word for a minute. But just one of the things that's worth noting about the psychiatric hospital scenes is that the patients are real psychiatric patients. Now, there's all sorts of issues about that. I mean, looking at that now, you kind of say, well, how right is that? I mean, it doesn't feel right at all. But it just adds to the thing that this is not a normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill film. That there's, and it's certainly not an ordinary run-of-the-mill soundtrack. And I mean, again, the soundtrack, if you listen to it, taken separate from the film, does it make a lot of sense? No, not really. But if you had The Exorcist without the music that's in it, it would not be The Exorcist. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And really, it all goes back to Friedkin and his choices, and what he knew, and his definite sense. He had a definite sense of every character, and we haven't mentioned at all William Peter Blatty, whose book, whose novel, The Whole Thing, is based on. Just simply wasn't time to do that. Very interesting character in his own right. But every character, whether it be Karras, whether it be Merrin, sorry, I got the name wrong here. It's Father Merrin, not Father Merlin. Merlin's a magician. And they all have this little depth they all have a depth in them. They all have a story to tell. And there's fear and horror everywhere. And what a success this movie is. I mean, dare we give it a score out of 10 as a soundtrack, Dan?
Yeah, well, as a soundtrack, yeah, I'd give it it's hard to rate it out of 10, because it's so unlike anything we usually discuss. Like, I will say, if you just look at Tubular Bells on its own again for a moment, my hot take of the night for that particular track on the album is that I think in some ways Tubular Bells sets the foundations for music that we saw in later decades. Like sometimes when I listen to that album, or that track even, I hear the kind of I hear the foundations of modern dance music, because it kind of loops a lot. It's repetitive, it builds, like it almost sounds like a track from a group like Orbital or something. Yeah. And then other times I think of modern bands like Sigur Rós in the way it's instrumental, it's atmospheric and so on. So I think it was a perfect track to go on the soundtrack. So overall, as a soundtrack, I'm gonna give it a very, very healthy. I'm gonna go 9, because as film soundtracks go, I think this is iconic. And as you said earlier, like there's tracks on this album you do not want to listen to on your own. Like I would strongly recommend, if you haven't watched The Exorcist or you haven't listened to the soundtrack, do neither on your own. Do it in the company of a trusted friend, or at least in the company of, you know, a relaxing drink or something, because I tell you, it'll frighten the life out of you.
Absolutely, Dan. And I'm gonna go with you on that one. Like, I'd certainly go with a 9 out of 10. The film for me is a 10 out of 10, and the book, incidentally, is a 10 out of 10. Get the book if you haven't read it, and certainly watch the film if you haven't seen it. But I'd imagine that most people listening to this podcast are very familiar with the film. And just like you shouldn't watch The Exorcist on your own, don't listen to the Big Album Show alone. Please, if you like this show, we're asking you, we're compelling you to please bring along another listener. We really appreciate our listeners, our friends out there. Thank you so much. And thank you to the people who gave comments on the show, and, you know, who promoted us online. Thanks to Linda, thanks to Reddy, thanks to somebody tagged Killing the Gascoon. Apparently he's a big fan, so shout out to him. Hope he enjoys. And as always, Dan, you know, please, you know, let's remind our listeners to support us on social media if they can. We really appreciate it. And remember to give us a little rating if you enjoyed the podcast. Dan, before we let our listeners go, we have some good pods coming up. Would you like to run through what they are?
Yeah, so we have, in no particular order, we're going to be talking with Tom Dunn of Something Happens. We're going to be looking at a very, very special album, Octung Baby. We're also going to be looking at Standing on the Shoulders of Giants by Oasis. Sometimes criticized, some love it. We'll be delving into that album. And if we get a chance,
by Radiohead as well.
I could talk about that one for more than one episode. It's incredible.
We're back up for every 2 weeks now, right until December. And we've got a great lineup of shows coming on next year. We got it's 25 years since the height of the Britpop period. We're going to be dealing with albums in the early part of 2022 by Texas, Alanis Morissette. I think Florence and the Machine is in there. So we've got a whole heap of really good pods coming up. And please, thank you for supporting us so far. And please continue to support us. And until the next time, thanks for listening.
Slán.
You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul and Dan. Please remember to subscribe, hit like, and remember to follow us on our social media platforms at The Big Album Show.